Good evening and welcome to the Journey Home. My name is Marcus Grodi, your host for this program. And it's always a pleasure to introduce to you men and women who, because of their love for Jesus Christ, their love for truth, were drawn home to the church. And our guest for this evening, a great pleasure to have this particular guest with us, Dr. Kevin Vost, revert, former atheist. He'll talk about that in a moment. But I want to say before I welcome him to the program is when I first knew of Dr. Vost was because I'd read one of his books, Fit for Eternal Life. It's about getting in shape. And as you can tell, I liked the book, but I didn't follow everything he said. But it's a super book. And I was able to contact him to find out more about not only what he wrote in that book, but about the aspect of understanding ourselves to need to grow, not just physically in shape, but spiritually and philosophically. It was a wonderful book. So Dr. Vost, welcome to the program.
Oh, pleasure to be here, Marcus.
It's great to have you here. Hopefully we'll get talking about some of your books later. I'm laying before me are a couple of your other books, Unearthing Your 10 Talents, From Atheism to Catholicism, which is the story of your conversion, right?
Yes, that is partially my reversion story.
And you've done a bookmark recently with Doug Keck, so that'll air soon, so you'll be able to hear more about his books. But thanks for joining us on the program, Kevin. It's great to have you here. Hopefully we'll get into talking about your fitness book a little bit later in the program, but now about your journey of faith. You've seen the program before, right?
Yes, actually, since I came back to the church about 7 years ago, I've seen it virtually every Monday night, give or take a couple here or there.
All right, so you know what you're in for. So I'm glad you're watching the program. I always invite the guests to start us away at the beginning of the journey, partly because I know we have a mixed audience. We have Catholics and non-Catholics. We even have atheists that watch the program, and they often wonder what was in his closet that opened his heart to the church. So why don't you start back at the beginning?
Sure, I'll go way, way back, Marcus, to something I think that we actually share in common, in that my mother had several miscarriages before I was born.
That's right.
About 5 of those. She was Catholic. In fact, my middle name is Gerard. It was named after St. Gerard of Majella, a patron of childbirth. Something I found just a few months ago, though, I was doing some research on the St. Kevin of Glendalough, Ireland, and I had heard that the name Kevin meant like fair or gentle, but I found it actually means fair or gentle birth. So interestingly, both of my names are related to childbirth, and I'm not sure if my mom knew that about Kevin or not, because they never told me that. But Mom was Catholic, Irish Catholic. My dad was a convert from, I believe, Methodism. I don't think my dad's family really was going to church regularly, but for the sake of my mother, he joined the church, and I was always proud of him when he would usher. Dad was kind of a rough and tumble guy. He was a plasterer. He's a man, I never remember him once reading a book or even watching a television program. He was a pure man of action. But every Sunday he would take us to Mass, and he'd put on his suit and go up and down those aisles. So that was very fond memories there. We went through Catholic school, my brother and sister and I, which was a wonderful experience. We were taught by Dominican sisters, all through grade school. And interestingly, though, we were a Catholic family, Mass every Sunday. Later I became, a server, altar server. But we really didn't talk about religion in the home at all. I remember in high school I took a religion class at the Catholic high school, and I needed a Bible, and we had to go to the Marian Center, our local Catholic bookstore, to buy one because we didn't have one that I could use. Remember, it was a Jerusalem Bible. Still have that one. So the faith wasn't really talked about much at home. We didn't have regular prayer or anything like that, but we did go to Mass regularly, went to the Catholic schools.
So as you look back, you're on what's often the typical conveyor belt for many Catholic children. You put them on the baptized, catechized, confirmed on the Catholic school, assuming at the other end you'll come out a good Catholic, which doesn't always work. But one of the problems is often that there's this compartmentalization between the faith and the rest of life. Is that how you would describe your upbringing?
Yes, it was sure there. Faith was something for Sunday's the active practice of the faith. Though the moral lessons, the ethical lessons, they came through and were lived in our lives. We learned to be honest and caring and so forth. So that came through. But other elements of the faith were really, kind of compartmentalized.
And your dad was going for you kids and his wife, not so much for himself, you think?
Yes, it seemed to be the case, yes. Mm-hmm. And then also, I realized, by the time I went to the Catholic high school there, I tended to be kind of an intellectual, kind of an egghead type person, always interested in deep thought. And I remember my early teens, I kind of developed those hypothetical thinking abilities that adolescents get. You can think in terms of if-then thinking. And I remember one time it occurred to me, if all this stuff I've been taught about Jesus all these years, if this is really true, then this is the most important material in all the universe, and I should really start, trying to live by it. At the time, I was really immersed in weightlifting, and some of my weightlifting buddies were, calling themselves born-again Protestants, and they were really in love with Jesus, and these were my friends. So for several years, I associated with them, and at times went to their Pentecostal church. Did spiritual reading myself. Never had a desire to leave the Catholic Church, though.
Do you feel at the time you look back that you were indeed experiencing a deeper walk with Christ, or was it still on the surface, or as you look back to that time?
Well, I think that, there was some element of a reality there.
Okay.
A contact with Jesus, maybe more on an emotional side. Things were kind of chaotic in the home, too, at this time. There may have been some reaction to that. But I did spend a few years, though, kind of deeply immersed in the faith at my level of understanding there. Mm-hmm. And interestingly, my friends here were these evangelicals and Pentecostals. Most of my friends were Catholics, but most of us had compartmentalized the religion.
Yeah.
None of my Catholic friends, when I started talking about Jesus, they would kind of give me a funny look, like, why are you talking about Jesus, But after a few years here, through my weightlifting, I was an avid fan of the muscle magazines, and there happened to be a top-level bodybuilder at the time who was like the heir apparent to Arnold Schwarzenegger. And he's a really brilliant man, really quite the intellectual. And I learned from him a lot of important things about physical training the body in very efficient ways, in being realistic. A lot of the magazines would give young kids the idea, if I eat all these supplements and lift weights 6 hours a day, I'm going to look just like Arnold Schwarzenegger. But this man, Mike Minster, told us the things about factors of your own genetics. He said the key factor in becoming a world-class bodybuilder is choosing the right parents. So, there's just certain realities there, the way your bone structure is.
Chicken and an egg issue right there.
Yes, you can't really do that, but ideally. But anyway, he was a very intelligent man. The things that I learned from him about weightlifting and nutrition I found to be very, very accurate. But he also had gotten into atheistic philosophies himself, and he wrote about this in his magazine articles. People like Friedrich Nietzsche and later Ayn Rand. And through him, I read some books about these people and then became immersed in those philosophers myself. So I reached a point in my late teens when basically for intellectual reasons, I was convinced that, well, God simply isn't true, and that if and then thinking is kind of like my if had been taken away. I was convinced through logical arguments that the idea of God didn't make sense, that it was contradictory. The idea that people would say, well, if God's all-powerful and all-knowing, if he knows what he's going to do tomorrow, then he can't do something different, can he? And these atheists would talk about this kind of thing, present it as if it was an unsolvable dilemma, and I didn't know the answer to that. It took me 20-some years to find the answer.
Maybe you're going to get to this later. You probably are. But right now, as I think about, okay, you're at the stage of your life right now that you're talking about, you're buying into the philosophy of an intellectual weightlifter who argues, on the one hand, for devoting a great part of your time to physical development, yet at the same time denies the reality of a creator of the very thing that you're trying to improve. In a sense, that seems illogical at that time. I mean, was this something later you saw, or at the time did it make sense to you? I mean, in other words, if there is no creator, there's no purpose, then why are we wasting time trying to make our body better?
Yeah, and at that point, no, I didn't think of it at that level. It took a long time before
So he wasn't addressing that either in his writing.
Oh, no, not at all. He was basically talking about these Nietzschean ideas, Ayn Rand, her philosophy called objectivism, without considering issues like that, without really addressing Christianity.
Which is funny then, because in a sense he was compartmentalizing too, in a way.
Yes, very much so.
He had his philosophy and his bodybuilding, but he wasn't bringing the two together just to make sense out of it.
Yeah, he'd kind of attempted a synthesis through some of these atheistic philosophies that were missing big chunks. Mm-hmm. They were, partial truths. There were some ideas of value in these different systems of philosophy, but they're missing the most important part, that creator that is responsible for.
So you bought into this?
I did. Like I said, I was intellectually inclined because of the partial truths in their philosophies that drew me in. For example, Ayn Rand in her philosophy of objectivism, very much pro-thinking, says our fundamental choice is to think or not to think, very much oriented towards achievement, making something out of your life, for individual freedoms and individual rights. She wrote these fictional novels with these heroic characters calling you to make the most of yourself, So there's a lot of partial appeal there. And it did draw me away. And to give you kind of a sense where my life was at this point where I drew away, we had our Catholic upbringing here. But by the time of my late teens, my mom had become very physically and mentally ill with a profound depression and severe heart failure. And my parents were separated, so Dad was only partially in the picture there. None of the family was going to church at this point. Then I had turned to atheism, and we actually ended up losing the house that we lived in too. There were all kinds of financial turmoil. So hopefully I'll get to it later, but all these loose ends were tied up later.
Sure.
Every single one of them. It's really amazing, God's grace, the way he did that later. But at this point in my life, we had all these things going on too.
When I think of the difference between atheist and an agnostic, I usually think of an atheist is talks about it. In other words, makes an issue of the atheism. Agnostic can be silent about it, not make a big deal about it, just not care about God. Or were you an outspoken advocate of these ideas?
Okay. Of the philosophy of objectivism, this later psychology called rational emotive therapy was another thing I was into that had atheistic elements. I was outspoken for the positive parts of those systems, for the value of the intellect and productive work, and in the psychology, the way you can have reason control your emotions and help keep you calm and so on. So those things I was very vocal in favor of. But no, I was never an outspoken atheist. I would never attack the church or anything. I mean, I grew up with enough of that to know that there was good there. So no, I was never outspoken against the church or anything.
All right. Was this then what led to your desire to go into psychiatry?
Yes. Well, actually, my primary interest was, I always loved philosophy. I loved those deep issues. And at this time, because of the way things were in our home, I wasn't going to be leaving home. I was going to stay in town, and we didn't have a philosophy major. So, well, what's the next best thing? And that ended up for me being psychology. So I did pursue a bachelor's degree in psychology. And while I was there going to college, I worked part-time as a weightlifting instructor. I met this female pupil of mine who was probably the honoriest one I ever came across. And we ended up getting married about a year and a half later and had a son. Went to work at a disability office for a government agency determining mental and physical disability cases. And about the late 80s, my mom's sister, Janet, one of my aunts, called and said, "Hey, you were halfway through a master's degree program. You need to finish that." And I think she's got a point there. I went back to school, still here in town while I was working, and finished a master's in general psychology, where I focused my master's thesis research on memory improvement techniques. And interestingly there, in reading the history of these techniques, I came across the figure of St. Thomas Aquinas as a person who was very influential in the history of these techniques. So I knew his name from growing up Catholic, but I didn't know very much about him, and I did not go directly into his writings. I just knew him as he related to these memory techniques. A couple years later, in the early 90s, I had the opportunity to go into a psychology doctoral program. Actually, the state of Illinois invited a school from Chicago to bring a program down to Springfield so students could do most of their study there. And I did that, obtained a doctorate in clinical psychology and focused on neuropsychology, like the early detection of Alzheimer's disease was my thesis, my dissertation subject matter. But all this time, I also taught on the university on the side for about 13 years, mostly the University of Illinois at Springfield, taught mostly developmental psychology, like the lifespan, and focused courses on adolescence or on psychology of aging. But all this time, I think I last taught in 2004, so all that time, though, I considered myself an atheist in the sense that I really didn't believe there was a God. But on the other hand, my wife and I also sent our children through Catholic schools. and I occasionally attended
Your wife
Mass.
wasn't practicing her faith at the time?
No, she never lost her faith.
Okay.
She was always a believer, but we would just occasionally go to church kind of when we thought we'd get in trouble because our kids are at Catholic schools and we're not going to church. So is that kind of a thing we were just...
I'm curious then at this stage, atheist, PhD in psychology, teaching it, that it seems that some of the very influential psychiatrists, psychological writers of the 19th and early 20th century had a major flaw in their understanding of the human person. And it would seem in psychology, if you don't believe there's a God, then it also touches on the belief in a soul or a person. And you really look at a human being from a totally scientific standpoint. Is that where you were at the time? Looking at the people you were talking about as purely the scientific, sensual being and not the soul aspect of their personality?
Yeah, I guess actually it kind of was that. I mean, I did not believe in the immortality of the soul. You know, I believe that people, I mean, there were persons that were worthy of respect and so on. The whole time, too, I did have a great respect for some of the ancient philosophy, like Aristotle. This Ayn Rand system of objectivism was built partially upon the Aristotle system. Also, this rational emotive therapy and psychology that I was really involved in was based upon much of the thinking of the ancient Stoics. Interestingly, Aristotle himself and the Stoics themselves, their reason led them to God. But it was these modern people who built upon their systems who had rejected him. And also in the field of psychology, so many of the prominent thinkers there did not include God. Alfred Adler, the namesake of the school I went to, he called God what he called a fictive goal. He thinks God is a wonderful idea that mankind has created, and then he kind of pulls us up. We try to live up to these standards that we create out of our own mind. So that was kind of some of Adler's take there.
The trajectory from Freud himself, right?
And yeah, and for Freud, in fact, those two were collaborated early on. Adler also had some very positive elements to his psychology. He talked about what he called a striving for superiority, not necessarily over others, but we try to make ourselves to grow and become more competent and so forth. But he said the most important principle is what he called social interest. And this is our ability to have a sense of community and fellowship with our fellow man. So he said the way we strive for superiority or to improve ourselves, it's going to be psychologically healthy if that is in line with this social interest, if we're striving to build ourselves in ways that will actually help others. So it was very much in line with the Christian ethic, but it just left out God. It's kind of like the second great commandment without the first.
So were you starting to see this then? Is that what was moving you in a direction toward the church or back to faith? Or?
Yes, it was kind of like so immersed in Ayn Rand's philosophy of objectivism. I probably would have called myself an objectivist in my 20s and 30s. But it was through one of her focuses too was on selfishness or self-interest. She said we should primarily look out for ourselves, not take anyone else's rights away from them or try to hurt them, but we should look out for number one. And if other people are benefited by that, well, that's fine, but that doesn't have to be our primary focus. But with Adler, he was tempering that with the focus on the other. At the time, I also had young children in my household. I say it's hard to keep yourself as your highest goal when you got this little baby looking at you and you realize you're partly responsible for that he's there. So yeah, this was starting to kind of break down some of these ideas and get me ready to, more willing to accept the notion of God.
Was there an event or something that moved you back in the direction of God, or was it more just the intellectual yearning?
Well, it was partially intellectual. I'm sure God was behind it, but it's actually I was reading one of those ancient Stoics, a book from the Loeb Classic Library, the ancient Roman Stoic, sure. Seneca. It was a Roman, and he had a little line in one of his books. It was just it was like nihil nimis est homanis occupati quam vivere, which basically was translated to say the one thing the busy man is least busy with is living. Okay, and here I was in 2004. I'd gone through school with young kids in the house. I stayed in my job through the great majority of that also until my internship year. I taught college on the side. I thought, I'm that busy man who doesn't have time to live. It occurred to me later, it's relevant also to Socrates saying, the unexamined life is not worth living. And also something I realized later that Jesus said, Martha, you're busy about many things, So that was really a turning point for me. I realized, well, I'm not going to teach anymore. I don't have time to reflect on things. Well, the next thing I knew, a few months later, I got a course in a teaching company on natural law. I'd enjoyed a previous course they had on the Stoics and one on Aristotle. The one on Aristotle was taught by a Roman Catholic priest, and so was this program on natural law. And in that program, he showed the influence of Aristotle, of the Stoics, and how Thomas Aquinas made this huge synthesis. He was so fundamental to some of our modern notions of human inalienable rights and the dignity of man and so forth. I'm thinking, well, here are these people who believe in God who are so fundamental to these things I think are of such importance. And here's this Roman Catholic priest teaching this course. And anyway, it was that course that led me to read some books, and it led me to read the writings of St. Thomas Aquinas for the first time. And then it was all over for my atheism from that point on.
I was going to say that when you read some of them, like Thomas Aquinas, were you open in reading it, or were you coming in with a big chip on your shoulder? And you're reading him through glasses based on Adler and the other?
Yeah, actually, I never read him directly, his own writings. Well, I might have had a book of like snippets from when I was a teen, but it was actually a book by Mortimer Adler, who was a 20th century philosopher and psychologist who spent most of his life outside the church, but a fan of Thomas Aquinas. He later became a Christian, in his last years of life, actually a Catholic. I was reading one of his books called How to Think About God, that I'd actually read in my early 20s thinking, well, maybe he can convince me to believe in God. And it didn't do it. But I read this same book 20 years later, and it really started to work on me, and then that led me to Thomas Aquinas. And something I discovered shortly afterwards was, in one of Pope Leo XIII's encyclicals from 1879, he said that, besides the grace of God himself, what's most likely to draw people who've devoted their lives to reason back into the church is the church fathers and the scholastics. And the chief scholastic there was St. Thomas Aquinas, and that was just so true in my case.
That's an interesting comment, because in the Reformation, one of the keys that led to that break was a rejection of the scholastics, or kind of a running away from the scholastics, especially in Martin Luther himself. Yes. And it seems that it was, I'm wondering if it was because, and I've heard this said many times, that it was his formation on the scholastics that was a bad formation on the scholastics that got him off in the wrong direction. You know what I'm saying? In other words...
Yes. And was Martin Luther, was he 1400s or so, I think? I think some of the peak...
Late 1400s, early 1500s.
Yeah, late 1400s, early 1500s. Some of the peak of the scholastic thought was coming in the 13th century with St. Albert the Great and St. Bonaventure and St. Thomas Aquinas. I'd heard that, maybe they'd gotten off on some different tracks after that. But yeah, it was those scholastics that pulled me back, because the scholastics, one thing about them, it was said of St. Thomas Aquinas that in some ways he was the greatest doctor of the church, because he so respected the church fathers and doctors that came before him that he in a way kind of inherited all of their thoughts. He wove it all together. His mastery of the Bible was amazing. Before I came back, I had this idea that the ancient philosophical systems were very profound, and the Bible, I didn't appreciate its depth. And when I read St. Thomas Aquinas, it just boggled my mind. He knew Aristotle and the Stoics far better than these modern philosophers that I read, and yet here he is also bringing in the scriptures, integrating all this in a way that just made incredible sense to me. It was a revelation. I've heard that it said that when Charles Darwin first read Aristotle, he said, these modern scientists I'm reading, they're mere schoolboys compared to old Aristotle. And that's how I felt when I read Thomas Aquinas. I thought, these atheists I'm reading, they're mere schoolboys and a schoolgirl, because they were Ayn Rand, compared to St. Thomas Aquinas. So that was a profound intellectual experience for me. And it started through the intellect.
I was going to say there'd be another double take in there, because Ayn Rand and the others would have, in their rejection of God, would have looked at the sacramental life as a fiction. Did you go through a transition there to recognize the transubstantiation, a lot of these things which have gone completely against a lot of your psychological teaching and training that you would have had before then?
Yes, like for Ayn Rand, for example, she said the world is ruled by faith, reason, and force. And she said that not only faith and reason don't mix, she said they go together like poison and food. She thought faith is something pre-scientific, pre-rational. And for a time I bought into that. So I'd see, well, theology, that's really a whole lot of much ado about nothing. If I didn't believe in God, I thought, well, what is all this theology? Later when I came to Thomas Aquinas, I saw how this is what explains it all. This is how fits everything in that picture. Thomas Aquinas is a master psychologist. The most profound understanding of psychology I've ever come across is in St. Thomas Aquinas, because he's informed not only by those prior philosophers and thinkers, but also by the Holy Scriptures. So that you talk about the completeness of truth, the fullness of truth. Yep. That's what I found in Thomas Aquinas, and then the other church fathers and other documents as I came back in.
Was it hard for you then to make the transition into accepting the validity of the sacraments, for example, as you came back into the church?
As I came back in a way, no, because there can be that leap between what they call the God of the philosophers. Yes, there is some kind of a prime mover or creative person out there, but is that the God of the Scriptures? Is that the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob? Is that Jesus Christ? And it was through Thomas Aquinas that leap was made. It was not hard at all. I went from one step to the next once I saw how seamlessly that was integrated, how it all made sense. Even has a few very pithy scriptural verses, even from Exodus, when God says, tells Moses, I am who am. That encapsulates this profound philosophical idea of God as a being whose essence is the same as his existence, and it's very, very abstract. But right from the start, I had seen how this all fits. It all makes sense.
Did it change your psychology? Your journey once you came back to the church, did it change how you understood your own vocation, your psychology that you were teaching and believing?
Well, yes, it sure did. Interestingly, when I would teach on moral development, I remember one class I had him in, I think he was going through the diaconate program. He said, the Catholic Church has some interesting takes on moral development. He gave me some literature on virtues, and I looked at it and thought, that's kind of interesting. I wouldn't realize that, 7 or 8 years later, I'd be writing books on this myself, based upon that Catholic understanding of virtue, which is built on the understanding of the human being, what it is to have a will and an intellect and have senses. So it just really integrated and brought my own view of psychology to a fullness it did not have before.
All right, Kevin, let's take a break now. We come back, I'd like to begin right there, is talk in more depth about your understanding of the virtues, the intellect, the will, especially in relationship to conversion, our moving closer to God. So let's do that when we come back.
Okay.
All right.
Sounds good.
See you in a bit. Welcome back to the Journey Home. Our guest this evening is Dr. Kevin Vost, and we're going to move on a little bit into these deeper issues that you've been writing about, intellect, will, virtues, vices. Before we go there, though, I want to make sure we covered all the aspects of your journey. And one thing that I know we didn't get back to was your family. How did they respond to your journey? What difference your journey made to your family?
Yeah, I'm glad that you asked that, because I talked at one point how things were kind of in a bad way in my late teens at the time that I had left. And it just amazed me the way over time God kind of tied up all those loose ends, gradually over time. 1986, my mom had all these problems with depression and heart failure. She was in the hospital and had 2 valves replaced. At exactly the same time, our first son was born. I remember making the hospital rounds, checking on my wife and my son and my mom. Interestingly, after that surgery, she was pretty much healed physically and mentally and spiritually. She got to the point where she worked. She had been a stay-at-home mother, but she worked selling ads for a senior citizens newspaper and was very, very proud of that. She's one of their prized employees. She did income taxes for people on the side, and she prided herself in not using a calculator. She did it pencil and paper.
The old-fashioned way.
Yes, and she was a tremendous fan of bingo. She went to bingo multiple times a week and hit many jackpots. And the most important thing about that is that who took her there was my father. My parents ended up reconciling. He treated her, just incredibly well, until the day she died. In fact, I remember, I think the first time I ever heard my dad cry was the day he called to tell me that mom was gone. She lived to see all 5 of her grandsons. So it was a very, very wonderful story. Also, later in the year 2002, my wife had noticed that a house was for sale in the newspaper, and it was the house that I'd grown up in. And we really, really loved that place. My parents had to sell it in the 80s because of their financial disaster. And so we went to look through the house, and my brother and his family actually went too. And ended up a few days later, we put down a bid for that house. We thought, we want to live there again. And a bid came in from another family the same day, also a full-price bid like we did. And the person selling it was a Baptist minister and his family. A really wonderful man. He was relocating back to another city. And the realtor had told him in the patio out on the side that my dad had built, it had my brother's name and mine and my sister's and a date there, with all of us there. And he said, he decided, no, this house has to come back to you. So we were able to buy back that house, let's see, in 2002. 2006, one day, doorbell rings, it's the front door, and it's a box of books. My first Catholic book, Memorize the Faith, had come out. And here we are. Actually, that book uses the rooms of a house as part of the memory method, and those rooms were based on that very house. And those books arrived at my door on July 12th, 2006, which was the 7th anniversary of my mother's death. So just really amazing, the way all that had tied in. And then my brother had come back to the church, so it's just kind of amazing the way God had tied in so many of these loose ends and made things. We really had a very happy ending at the end there.
The way the Lord works, and sometimes God works that way in people's lives, but they don't take the next step of seeing that it was the work of God. They coincidence.
Yes.
And just see it at more of a horizontal level rather than seeing the God side of it, which was really parallel to your own journey of faith. Moving away from seeing life without God and then now seeing God as purpose in all the little things of life.
Exactly. But that's one thing, a coincidence. I believed in coincidence all those years. I did not believe in God's providential plan, and it's since I've been back, I'm amazed to see the way God does work. And sometimes it takes a long time. It took me 25 years to come back to the church. And I should say, too, that it was this intellectual thing that brought me back. It was the intellect that pulled me away in some sense, and then it was the intellect that brought me back through Thomas and other figures. But the one thing I felt like I really came back home was probably the first time in 25 years that I had read the Gospels and read those passages from Jesus and stuff. I didn't give up just some abstract notion of God. I mean, I'd given up the acknowledgement of Jesus Christ himself, that the truth is a person. And that's when it really hit home, and the great sense of joy had come back to me at being back. It's far more than just the head; it's the whole person.
Kevin, looking back, I'm not looking for you to point fingers at anyone, in terms of why, after all that formation, you left the church. But when you look back, especially thinking about other Catholic young people brought up in the church, yet lose their faith, drift away, either into nominalism or atheism or agnosticism. I mean, what happens? What happened as you think about what was missing that may have kept you from drifting?
Yeah, that's a very important question. Maybe partially when I grew up and went through school in the late 60s and the 1970s, different things going on in church, kind of changing some of the teaching methods. But even though I was intellectually inclined and I was a very good student, I really knew nothing about the intellectual depth of the church. I mean, when I had left it, I thought, well, I'm seeking wisdom and knowledge and truth, and I want this deep philosophy. I had no idea that the deepest of all philosophy was right where I was to begin with, within the church. So I was not aware of Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine. I mean, I'd heard their names, but I wasn't aware of the depth of their teaching. Another person influential when I came back was G.K. Chesterton. I don't remember ever hearing about him, except maybe in books of quotations, until I'd come back to the church in the 40s. So I'm thinking, well, gosh, how come kids growing up Catholic don't know about some of these monumental figures? And just such a glory to our tradition. So that was it. I mean, I really, when I left, I did not understand what it was I was leaving.
You also mentioned at one point that something came up where you needed to read the Bible and you didn't even have one in the house. I mean, you as a young man going to Mass would have heard Scripture read every single time, but there was a sense in which it had not become a part of your life, right? I mean, it was kind of there. You heard it on Sunday, but didn't, maybe not even realize it was from the Bible. It was from the liturgy, the lectionary, but not the Bible. And sometimes I think that's where we miss out, letting our young people really understand the beauty of Scriptures.
That's absolutely true. And and one thing that I realized when I came back, of course, now our church has also been blessed in the United States with so many converts, with that great deep appreciation for the Bible. So I've read the books, your books, Scott Hahn, and people like that. And yes, now I do see how that Mass, oh my gosh, it's completely, ties into Scripture in every single part. I had no idea growing up, all those years going through Mass after Mass after Mass. I had no sense of just how deeply that was integrated with the Scripture. And also there's that stance of the church that, truth is truth no matter where it comes from. That's why when I found someone like Thomas Aquinas, I love Aristotle, I love the writings of the Stoics, it's all there, except he even improves upon them and adds revelation on top of all that reason for the complete package, what John Paul called the two wings of truth, faith and reason. It opened my mind then to see and to be open to faith, not as something that opposes reason, but as something that completes it and fulfills it.
It's interesting that you did have a period there when you were very much into your weightlifting, where you said your best buddies were the born again Bible only folk.
Yes.
But that hadn't drawn you away. Why did that not catch you at the time? Was it because it wasn't intellectual enough, or?
Well, possibly. I thought the core of this, they had the love for Jesus Christ. I also had that as a Catholic, so it was no pull away from there. But it was at this time, we were in our teens, and there was not a great deal of intellectual depth to it. In fact, I remember one of my friends was also a former Catholic, and there was no fire in the people he was around, so he was pulled and became evangelical or Pentecostal. I don't recall exactly which, but no, that never pulled me away from the church. It was the systems of philosophy a few years later that did.
Okay. We have an email. Let me take this now. It might lead us into our other discussions. We were thinking about from Deborah from Oregon. How can I respond to critics who claim that philosophy and science leave no room for belief in God?
Okay, that's a good question there. And many modern scientists and philosophers would try to argue that. I think it's actually the exact opposite. It's in the Scriptures, Romans 1:20. St. Paul says that we can see through the world, through what God has made, His effects. We can reason our way back to God. So we can start by using our senses, by using our intellects. Reason will lead to the existence of God. St. Thomas Aquinas, his classic 5 proofs, that had some impact on me. They're covered very briefly in the Summa Theologica and in much more depth in the Summa Contra Gentiles. There he shows how you can start with natural reason, start with things that you can see, like the fact that things change and things move, that one thing causes another, and your reason actually will lead you to the idea that there has to be a God. There has to be a being whose essence is to exist, because nothing on earth that we see can give itself its own existence. Matter can't do that. Matter can't produce new matter from no matter at all. Only God can. And in the Catholic tradition, you do have these rational methods that lead you to the acceptance of God, but then we also have revelation. So the rational methods, we kind of go from the bottom up, from our senses up towards God. In a revelation, we have this direct information from God in revelation and the actual incarnation. So no, there's no reason. Reason properly applied should lead us toward God, not away.
Did in the process in your journey, did you early on read John Paul's encyclical on faith and reason?
I did, yes. One of the first few years I was back, I read his encyclical, Fides et Ratio, Faith and Reason,
right.
And I thought that's absolutely wonderful and beautiful. In fact, for the book of my reversion story, the first quotation I have is from John Paul. Mm-hmm. And here's where he's saying that even in the writings of people who try to drive faith and reason farther apart, there are partial truths. And he said, we can possibly get insights there that can lead us to the full truth. And I thought that it is so true. Some of these atheistic philosophies do have some partial truths, not the fact of their atheism, but other things they write about, psychology, philosophy, science. So it doesn't hurt to learn and rationally examine those. But in the fullness of truth, you're also open to faith. And I didn't read it until,
So after you're back in
after back, all those years when John Paul was the Pope, wasn't aware of what a profound person that we had. I mean, such a holy person and such an intelligent person.
Would you agree that with the irony that, on the one hand, the scientists, the atheists, think that it's their intellectualism that keeps them from believing in God. In reality, it's their ignorance that keeps them from believing in God. Would you agree with that irony?
Yes. I think it is their ignorance, and sometimes too, it's like a intellectual pride or hubris, or arrogance, that the idea that they so easily dismiss so many of these powerful thinkers throughout 2,000 years, who their reason has led them to God. Right. It's like some of the new atheists think that reason developed when they themselves became able to reason, and they discount all this profound thought before them.
Yeah, I forget. There's a great book that talks about the 1300s, maybe it's the 13th century. The beauty and the intellect of that century that most of us today look back and think, we're so much smarter today than way back when. But that's when all the universities were started. All the great writers, like you said, Aquinas, and you just have a new book coming out about Albert the Great. Yeah. Tell the audience about Albert the Great, because there's a lot. I never heard of Albert the Great when I was outside the church.
Yeah, St. Albert the Great, he was a person who was called the Great while he was still alive. He was such an incredibly intelligent and learned man in the natural sciences. He wrote books about animals and plants. He said the earth was round. He said the features of the moon were actual, like mountains and indentations, not just optical illusions. He had all this profound science and also theology wrapped into one. He was Thomas Aquinas' teacher, brought out that incredible brilliance in philosophy and theology in St. Thomas Aquinas. So when I was away from the church, I had this profound respect for the ancient Greeks and Romans. When I came back in, my mind was blown away by that 13th century. Yeah. Incredible depth of knowledge. Sometimes people get this idea of these scholastics. These are the guys who said, how many angels can dance on the top of the head of a pin. But when you actually go and read what people like St. Albert and St. Thomas wrote about, it's just incredible. And it's an incredible love for the world. They saw God reflected in creation, so they studied creation.
Well, one of the things that arose during that time before Luther, that influenced Luther, is the rise of nominalism as a philosophy that's very influenced us today. Is that something that you also studied in your journey to realize how much that infects psychology and philosophy today?
Yes, there are some of the modern philosophies that really kind of got off the beam in many, many ways, right. Becoming very subjective, kind of ignoring the capacity for objective truth. I found that so many the relativism is so rampant today because of these philosophical ideas that were started around that time. So that has had a very important influence.
Yeah, I think to an extent that most of us in our culture are blind to the levels at which it affected us and how we understand the human person because of these philosophies that have infiltrated the media. It's just there. And our Catholic faith is just so key, I think, to cutting through it all. But it isn't automatic, right? Just because you go to Mass doesn't mean all of a sudden you become magically aware of this, that Catholics can be easily as blind to it as the rest in our culture. In fact, let's take this next email, because this one might get us into a question I'd like to ask you. Jim from Louisville writes, says, I'm one of the only practicing Christians in my workplace, and most of my colleagues consider themselves agnostics or atheists. While I don't want to formally enter into debates with them, does Kevin have any practical tips I could use to share my faith with those who are so far from God?
Okay, that's a very relevant question. My workplace is very much like that also. Right. And of course, the first thing is to try to embody Christian behavior in your interactions with these people. Just show them there's that the fundamental, it's not just in the head, it's about we're supposed to love each other. So be caring, be that person that kind of reflects that Christianity, Christ within your soul. But in terms of debate, I would just kind of be open to the kind of subject matter they're talking about. If they bring up certain books or certain topics, maybe you're aware of something in the Catholic world that addresses that, so you might just very respectively ask them if they've heard about this one or engage them on that particular subject matter. Personally, I don't usually, bring up issues like this to people out of the blue, but if they have talked about something that's relevant, then I will engage them.
Avery Dulles' book on the history of apologetics kind of is the story of fighting these battles with those outside the church to defend the reality of the Christian faith, and it's a wonderful book published by Ignatius Press that talks about that whole journey. Mm-hmm. But Kevin, part of the issue that I want you to think about also, though, is it's one thing you can see it in your coworkers. Yeah, they don't believe in God, and they're caught up in these philosophies. And what can you do for yourself to recognize the ways you may have bought into bad philosophies from the soup of your culture, but not aware of it yourself? Any ideas from as a psychiatrist, excuse me? How do you break through that in yourself to move forward?
Okay, well, yeah, because it is all around us. We're immersed in it and don't even think about it. What I have done myself since I came back is, I just try to immerse myself in that counterculture, which is the Catholic culture now. Myself, it's through my reading, through Catholic radio, through Catholic television. For myself, I try to, there's no saying that you become what you think about. So I try to think about those things that are worth thinking about. That's one of the keys of the virtue of wisdom, is that you focus on what's really important. So my advice for the Catholic, him or herself, or the Christian who wants to stay that way, is immerse your own thoughts, your radio, your television, your reading, and then of course your actual participation in Mass and your receiving the sacraments. Just immerse yourself in that wonderful Catholic world.
Part of that media around us that has fed us for so many years, at least in my lifetime, which almost parallels television, is that so many good aspects of our faith are belittled. I remember growing up as a child watching the comics, and it shows that little picture of the devil and the angel on your shoulder fighting at you. Yes. So in your mind you get this idea that that's not really real, that's a joke, but it's true, that spiritual battle. Is that a little bit what you write about in your book on virtues and vices? How do you cut through the voices in your life so that you can choose the right one and be obedient to God?
Okay, well, one thing I talk about with the virtues, and again I borrow mostly from Thomas Aquinas here, is the idea that virtues are perfections of our powers, our capacity, so they make us all that we can be, but they're also habits. Virtues are good habits, essentially. And habits you have to build by thinking about the right things, by acting on them every day. So you have to actually practice them day after day after day, and that's part of that immersion there, not in the worldly culture, but in the Catholic counterculture. So part of it is, to really build virtue in your soul, you must think it, feel it, live it, do it every day.
An email from Carrie from Connecticut. In Dr. Vost's experience, can living an active lifestyle have an influence on a person's spiritual life? And if so, in what ways?
Okay, an active lifestyle, that's interesting. I know one of the Dominican sayings is they want to share with others the fruits of their contemplation. So kind of an ideal lifestyle is where you're contemplating, focusing on God, meditating on the scriptures and study. But then, from what you learn, from what's infused in your soul, that overflows and you go out and act. So ideally, an active lifestyle is good as long as you don't neglect that contemplation, as long as you have that time to reflect and focus on what's important. Part of my own problem is having too active a lifestyle, like I talked about. If you don't leave yourself time to reflect, then you'll be all the more susceptible to the culture around you. So that's one of the risks of being too active, is you don't have that time to reflect, and then you'll be even more susceptible to those negative messages.
If you would talk a little bit about the parallels between the physical disciplines and the spiritual disciplines, since they both have the same fingerprints of God on them.
Yeah, and that's good too, because another thing, when I came back to the church, I realized so many things I was interested in when I was away from the church. I didn't realize how the church had talked about them, how the church had a full picture of them. And one of those is physical training, taking care of your body. Mm-hmm. St. Paul says the body is the temple of the Holy Spirit. A very strong Christian theme is that a Catholic understanding is that we are, mind and body, soul and body unities. A human person is both. We're not just a soul who's in this machine which is our body. We're a composite. We're made of both. And God calls us to take care of both. And the healthier we are, the fitter we are, the more likely we are to feel better, to have energy to do things for others. So they're very closely entwined. We really are called to be stewards of our body. It doesn't mean to become obsessed. It doesn't mean to try to be super lean or look like a bodybuilder or a runway model or something. But just that care of our body that's likely to make us healthier, to give us more energy, is very important. And you can also incorporate spiritual methods. My friend Peggy Bowes writes about the rosary workout.
Right.
And she has a system where you pray the rosary while you work out. My own methods of fitness focus on building virtue. They also focus on being very, very brief, so it does not pull your time away from other responsibilities, my kind of strength training methods. So there's just all sorts of ways that the physical and the spiritual are intertwined, and the Catholic Church has God's perspective on that.
Yeah, because again, we're not a soul trapped in a body. We are one person, soul and body. And the disciplines of the spirit often parallel disciplines of the body. What we can learn about our diet, if we eat the wrong diet, we're going to be sick. Well, it's the same thing spiritually. If we're not spending time with certain, really, it's really all the mind of God helping us understand how we can grow in union with Him through the discipline of our body, which helps us discipline our will. There's another thing, the intellect and the will. Talk a bit about that, because my background in Protestantism didn't make the distinctions as clearly between intellect and will, free will, responding to God's call in our life in obedience to Christ.
And this is the thing, too, that many of the atheist thinkers, some scientists and philosophers, kind of ignore, too. People like Thomas Aquinas talk about different layers or characteristics of the soul, the vegetative that we share with plants for nutrition and growth and so on. Because the first function of the soul is just to make something alive. An animate object, anima is a Latin for soul, so something that's alive has a soul at some level. But we talked about the vegetative soul, things like nutrition and growth and reproduction, the sensitive soul that animals we share with the animals, the ability to perceive through our five senses for motor abilities to move about and so forth. But only humans have this intellectual layer to the soul, where we can think at a conceptual level. We can also direct our actions by our will. Animals act according to instinct. Because of our intellecting, we can understand things at a deeper level. Then we can choose alternate courses of action. So there's the will. So those are also two of the ways that we're made in God's image. We can understand things through our intellect, and we can make choices through our will. For us, it's limited, and it works through a series of steps. For God, it's total, and it's instantaneous. But yeah, part of the way that we're made in the image of God is the fact that humans uniquely have these intellectual capacities and this capacity to choose.
Let's assume that we've got listening to your story, someone that's an atheist or agnostic or left the faith, maybe hasn't thought about it but happened to tune in tonight. What would you like to say to them about the need to come back to the church?
Okay, since my own journey tended to be on such an intellectual basis, I'd give maybe 4 reading assignments. Not that you had to do all these. 2 are very brief. If you read the encyclical Aeterni Patris, Pope Leo XIII, 1879. Another is that Faith and Reason, John Paul II's encyclical from 1998. Those are brief. If you want a 3,000-page reading assignment, I'd say actually open up the Summa Theologica, which is available online, as are most of these documents. A 4th is then also look at the Catechism of the Catholic Church, because this is a distillation of all this incredible wisdom. There's incredible beauty in there, incredible depth. So I would just say try to muster up within yourself the courage and the humility to do a little searching, and I'd recommend documents like those.
One that I might just throw in there, Peter Kreeft has a nice little Summa of the Summa. For those who are just beginning, you don't want to jump into the 3,000-page one, that he condenses it down quite a bit, right?
Yes, exactly. I had that book. That's an excellent way to go. There's also just many, many wonderful books written about St. Thomas Aquinas that can draw you in. G.K. Chesterton's classic biography is just a pure joy. That would be another place to go.
All right, Kevin. Hey, in case the audience want to connect with you and your writings, do you have a website that you might want to mention?
Yes, I do. It's drvost.com, just drvost.com. kevin.com, and people can contact me through the site if they like.
All right, Kevin. Thank you for joining us.
Okay,
on
thank
this
you,
program.
Marcus.
Thank you so much for your writing and for your witness. I appreciate it so much.
Thanks for all you do.
Thank you for joining us on this program. I'd encourage you to look at some of his other writings, because I think both intellectual as well as a physical, he helps us give our whole body to our Lord Jesus Christ and to grow in obedience to him. Thank you for this program. I hope it's been encouragement to you in your walk with Christ.